My name is Grace Allen. I'm 32 years old. 6 weeks ago, I woke up from a 9-hour spinal surgery. The surgery I had waited 3 years and 4 months for. The surgery that was supposed to give me my body and my future back. And through the thick chemical fog of post-operative anesthesia, with my back feeling like it had been split open and soldered back together by someone who had never met me, my phone lit up with 73 missed calls. And when I finally managed to play my father's voicemail, Dale's voice was calm, almost cheerful. The voice of a man who had already decided how the conversation was going to end. And he told me that while I was unconscious on the operating table, while surgeons were reconstructing my vertebrae to preserve my ability to walk, my parents had sold my condo. They had forged my signature on a power of attorney, found a cash buyer they had been secretly negotiating with for weeks, timing every step with deliberate precision around the window of my surgery, when they knew I would be chemically silenced and legally incapable of stopping them. And they had liquidated $425,000, every single cent of equity I had spent 8 years of my life building, to pay for my younger sister Tessa's wedding. And what happened 3 weeks later at that wedding, in front of 200 guests at the lodge at Torrey Pines on a cloudless San Diego morning, is something that not one person in that room was remotely prepared for. If what you just heard already has your pulse running, do me one small favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment with where you're listening from right now, and if you want to hear exactly how this ends, hit subscribe because this builds to something that 200 people will carry with them for the rest of their lives. It means more than you know. Now let me take you back 7 weeks. 7 weeks before the wedding, I sat in the glass-walled office of my neurosurgeon at Scripps Memorial Hospital in La Jolla, looking out at a pale strip of Pacific coastline shimmering in the thin February light. And I heard the words I had been waiting 3 years and 4 months to hear. We have a surgery date. Herniated discs at L4 and L5, a nerve compression that had been quietly dismantling my quality of life since I was 29, sending white-hot sciatic fire down my right leg on the bad days, and a creeping, patient numbness into my right foot on the days that frightened me more. Because pain means the nerve is still fighting, and numbness means it is losing. My neurosurgeon, Dr. Erica Pham, told me March 15th was the date, that the procedure would take between 8 and 10 hours under general anesthesia, that they would be working at the base of my spine with a precision that required stillness I could not provide while conscious, and that full recovery required 6 weeks of rest and the kind of patience I had spent my entire adult life working around rather than practicing. I drove home along the I-5 with something unfamiliar moving in my chest. Hope. The kind of raw, tentative, almost embarrassed hope that arrives after a very long absence and does not quite know if it is still welcome. And that evening, from my condo in North Park, I called my parents. My mother, Diane Allen, answered on the third ring with the distracted energy of someone in the middle of something considerably more important. And in the background, I could hear the distinctive, high-pitched, performative laughter of my younger sister Tessa, 28 years old and 4 years deep into a wellness and lifestyle content creation career that had generated 12,000 Instagram followers, a number that a third-party audit would later confirm was roughly 70% purchased bot accounts and zero sustainable income in any quarter it had operated. I told my mother I had a surgery date, that it was March 15th, that the procedure was serious and the recovery would take 6 weeks, that I would need someone to drive me home from Scripps after and check in on me in the first days when mobility would be severely limited. And the silence that followed had a texture I had spent 32 years learning to recognize. the texture of someone rapidly calculating how this information intersected with their own schedule and finding the intersection inconvenient. "March?" she said, and her voice had already pivoted from distracted to inconvenienced, the shift so practiced and so immediate it had the quality of a reflex. "Sienna, that's right in the middle of final wedding prep. You know how much Tessa needs me right now. The venue walkthroughs, the final dress fittings, the catering confirmations." I told her I understood, that I would figure it out like I always figured things out, that I just thought they should know about the surgery date. And she said, with the casual, settled authority of someone delivering a policy statement rather than a personal opinion, "You've always been the independent one, Grace. You'll be fine." She hung up before I could say goodbye, and I sat in my condo in North Park, watching the last light drain from the sky over the 163 freeway, feeling the specific, bone-deep 32-year-old weight of not being surprised. I want to tell you something about who I was before I tell you what they made me become, because this story does not make complete sense without the architecture that preceded it. I grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Claremont Mesa, the elder of 2 daughters, and from the time I was roughly 12 years old, I understood, with the particular clarity that children develop when the truth is never spoken aloud but is present in every room, embedded in the walls, audible in the specific quality of silences, that I occupied a fundamentally different position in this family than my younger sister did, and that this difference was not temporary or situational, but structural, a load-bearing assumption of the household. When I was 12, my father Dale sat me down at the kitchen table and told me I was not the pretty one in the family. And he delivered this information in the manner of someone performing a kindness, a blunt, cheerful pragmatism, as though by managing my expectations early, he was doing me a favor worth gratitude, his hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture intended to be paternal that felt like a verdict being handed down. "You're the smart one," he said. "You'll have to work harder, but you'll be fine." And so I built my entire life around that single instruction, with the obedient, determined precision of a person who has been handed a blueprint and told it is the only one available. I graduated summa cum laude from UC San Diego with a degree in computer science. My parents were not at the commencement ceremony because Tessa had a callback for a local car dealership commercial that paid the performer in what the casting notice called exposure, and which ultimately did not produce a booking. I went directly into the workforce after graduation, spent 6 focused years climbing from junior analyst to lead threat intelligence analyst at a defense tech contractor in the Sorrento Valley, working the kind of hours that leave your social life as a concept rather than a practice. And when I was 27, I walked into a bank on a Tuesday morning, alone, and signed the papers that made me a homeowner. 800 square feet of industrial chic living space in North Park, 1 bedroom, a kitchen the dimensions of a generous closet, a balcony barely wide enough for 2 chairs, and a small coffee plant that thrived on neglect, and not a single cosigner or parental contribution anywhere in the financing documents. The whole thing was mine, bought with 5 years of 60-hour work weeks, 2 completely skipped vacations, and the accumulated, compounded discipline of someone who learned at 12 that no one was coming to help her and decided to become someone who did not need them to. When I closed on that condo, when I called home to share the news of the thing I had built entirely from scratch, my father's first response was not pride and not congratulations. He walked through the kitchen, looked at the appliances, looked at the dimensions of the living room, and said, "Why didn't you use this money to help your sister instead? She needs it more than you need another investment property." That was the precise moment I understood that in the Allen family economy, my success was never a milestone to be acknowledged on its own terms. It was a resource, standing by for redistribution to wherever the family decided the need was greater. And the need was always, always greater on Tessa's side of the ledger. Let me tell you about Tessa, because she is not a passive character in this story. She is an architect, and the blueprint she worked from was drawn long before the wedding. Tessa Allen had never held a paying position for longer than 3 consecutive months, a pattern she attributed to office culture stifling her creative frequency and authentic self-expression. When she turned 21, our parents bought her a brand new BMW 3 Series in pearl white. When I turned 21, I was pulling double shifts at a diner 4 blocks from the UCSD campus, keeping my 2003 Corolla alive with a combination of prayer and deferred maintenance, paying my own tuition because the scholarships covered most but not all of it, and the difference was mine to solve. The explanation my mother always offered for this discrepancy, delivered with the unwavering confidence of someone stating a natural law, was, "Tessa needs more support," as though my sister's helplessness were a fixed property of the universe rather than a behavioral pattern that had been systematically rewarded since she was old enough to understand that performing need produced better outcomes than demonstrating capability. The week before my surgery, I prepared everything myself with the systematic efficiency of someone who has long since stopped waiting to be offered help. I hired a home care aide for the first 2 weeks of recovery through a licensed agency in Mission Hills. I spent an entire Saturday filling my freezer with a month's worth of prepared meals, portioned, labeled, stacked with the organizational logic of someone who would not be standing comfortably at a stove for several weeks. I rented an adjustable hospital-grade bed frame from a medical supply company in Kearney Mesa and built a full recovery station in my living room. Everything within arm's reach, nothing requiring stairs. A setup designed by someone who had spent a career anticipating system failures and building redundancy into every layer. My parents called me 3 times in the 5 days before my surgery, and not once across those 3 calls did anyone ask if I needed anything, because the 3 calls were not welfare checks. They were funding requests, each one arriving with an updated tally of wedding expenses and an implicit invitation for me to close the gap. On the final call, the week before I was scheduled to go under general anesthesia for potentially 10 hours, my mother told me the venue alone had come in at $80,000, that Tessa's custom lace gown ordered from a Parisian atelier was $22,000 before alterations, and that the Whitfield family, Grant's family, prominent across regional banking in the Southwest, were watching the entire event with the evaluative attention of people for whom optics are not a preference, but a professional standard. I reminded her I had already given $20,000 for the engagement party. She said, with the gentle, unbothered cruelty that only a very specific kind of mother can deploy without seeming to notice she is being cruel. "That was months ago, Grace. This is the main event." I told her I had major surgery in 5 days and had nothing more to give, and the temperature in her voice dropped to the particular cold that communicates not merely disapproval, but a weary, theatrical disappointment, as though my refusal to bleed a little more was a character flaw she had long since accepted, but would never entirely stop mourning. Now I need to tell you the thing I have never told anyone outside of a single trusted attorney, because it is the structural secret on which the entire final act rests, and without it, the story is incomplete. In the spring of 2021, during the period when the economy was convulsing and financial stability had become something people discussed in the past tense, a college friend who worked in private wealth management called me and told me, in a voice kept deliberately low as though the walls of her office might be listening, that my parents were $180,000 in debt and 60 days from a foreclosure notice being executed on the house at 247 Maple Drive in Claremont Mesa. My father had been chasing cryptocurrency investments that a friend of a friend had described as essentially guaranteed, the kind of sure thing framing that only works on people who have already decided to believe it. My mother had been sustaining a social calendar and a lifestyle that required the budget of a person with considerably more income than a regional VP of pharmaceutical sales actually generates. They had been hiding the foreclosure notices, intercepting the mail, maintaining the performance of their lives even as the foundation was actively giving way beneath it. I sat in my condo and stared at the walls I had worked so hard to build around myself, and I thought about my parents losing that house. The house where my childhood height marks were still penciled into the kitchen door frame in my mother's handwriting. The house that smelled like lemon verbena candles and Dale's morning coffee. The house where I had grown up feeling like a tenant rather than a daughter. And I made a decision that I still believe was made entirely from love, even knowing what I know now, even having lived what came after, because the love was real even when it was not returned. I called a real estate litigator named Marcus Vane, whose office was downtown San Diego on Ash Street, a man unruffled by complexity and precise in his assessment of what was possible and what was not. I told him what I wanted to do, and he told me it could be structured cleanly through an anonymous LLC, that the occupants of the property would never know who held the deed unless someone specifically commissioned a deep ownership trace, that it was completely legal, invisible from the tenant side, and permanent unless I chose to change it. 3 weeks later, the debt was purchased, the ownership transferred, and I held the deed to 247 Maple Drive in my name through a blind trust, while my parents signed a lease-to-own agreement with what appeared to them to be a faceless investment management company that had, in their telling of the story to family friends, swooped in and saved us. Every month for 4 years, their rent check, frequently late, always accompanied in Diane's texts to her friends by complaints about the corporate greed of the management company that owned their home, was deposited into a private account I maintained for exactly that purpose. I did not tell them. I did not tell anyone. I did it because I loved them, with the irrational, expensive, unreciprocated love that some children carry for parents who have never quite earned it, and because I could not watch them become homeless, even if they had spent 30 years watching me become invisible. But sitting in a hospital recovery room 6 weeks ago, with 73 missed calls on my phone and Dale's cheerful voice explaining what they had done while I was unconscious, that love had finally reached the end of the line it had been traveling for 32 years. And what replaced it was something harder and clearer and considerably more useful. March 15th, Surgery Day. I remember the quality of light in the pre-op room at Scripps Memorial. The specific blue-white fluorescence of a space built for efficiency rather than comfort. The cool paper of the hospital gown against my arms. The anesthesiologist's voice explaining the sequence of events with the practiced calm of someone who has delivered this particular briefing 10,000 times and means it sincerely every single time. telling me to count backward from 10, and I made it to 7. 9 hours later, I opened my eyes in the recovery room, and the first sensation was pain, so total and so architectural that it felt less like an injury and more like a new and comprehensive understanding of what my body was capable of producing. My back, a long, searing line of heat, my throat raw from the intubation tube, even my eyelids weighted with the residual chemistry of prolonged anesthesia. A nurse's face materialized above me in soft focus, and she said the surgery had gone well, and she smiled with the genuine warmth of someone who understands that this particular moment, the return to consciousness after something long feared, is significant, and she handed me my phone. 73 missed calls. The number arranged itself in my still fogged vision with the clean legibility of a system alert. My first conditioned response was fear. Something has happened to someone I love. And my second thought, arriving approximately 2 seconds behind it with the cold, familiar weight of a pattern I had lived inside my entire adult life, was that whatever this was, it was probably about the wedding. I opened my father's voicemail. Dale's voice was the voice of a man who has pre-rehearsed the conversation, decided on the framing, anticipated the likely objections, and pre-categorized them as obstacles to be managed rather than legitimate responses to be considered. He told me they had made a family decision while I was unavailable. He told me they had found a cash buyer for my condo several weeks earlier, and I want you to hear those words clearly, because several weeks earlier means the negotiation began long before I went into surgery, which means this was not an impulse decision made under pressure, but a deliberate campaign planned around the specific window of my medical unavailability, and that he had signed the final paperwork on my behalf. The money, he said, was going toward Tessa's wedding, that she deserved a beautiful day, and that I wasn't using the condo much anyway, being single. He ended the message with, "Love you," in the same tone he would use to end a routine voicemail to a colleague. I played it again. The morphine was performing its best work, softening the edges of the physical world, but the cold, clean fact of what that message contained cut through every layer of pharmacological cushioning without resistance. And I lay on that recovery room bed, staring at the perforated acoustic ceiling tiles, and breathed with the mechanical, deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided in real time that falling apart is not currently available as an option. I want to pause here for just a moment, because if you have ever been the invisible one in your own family, the one carrying the weight while everyone else takes the credit, the one whose needs are perpetually deferred in favor of someone else's wants, what I'm about to share is going to land somewhere real. If this story is already speaking to something you felt, hit that like button and drop a comment below. It helps this reach more people who need to hear it. Now let's get back to what I did next. 2 hours after waking from surgery, still in the recovery suite with the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen monitor marking time in the background, I called my father. My hands had stopped shaking, not because the shock had passed, but because something colder had arrived to replace it. A crystalline, clarifying coldness that I recognized from my professional life as the mental state that arrives when the analysis is complete and the decision has been made. Dale picked up on the second ring from the background noise of a Starbucks, and he greeted me with the tone of a man checking in on a minor inconvenience that has since resolved itself, asking how the surgery went, whether the doctors had fixed that discomfort I'd been dealing with, and I said, "You forged my signature, Dale. While I was under general anesthesia, you forged a power of attorney and transferred title to my property." That is a federal crime. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who has been caught and is processing the weight of what he has done. It was the silence of a man running contingency calculations, selecting a fallback position, deciding which version of himself to present next. He said forged was a very litigious word, that they had simply facilitated a transaction in the family's best interest, that I would have agreed if I hadn't been preoccupied. I said, wire fraud, identity theft, grand larceny. Those are not family discussions. Those are the federal charges currently applicable to what you did. He hung up. And he hung up the way people who have never been told no by someone they have always treated as a subordinate hang up, when the truth finally runs out of exits to escape through. 20 minutes later, my mother called, leading with my full name in the 3-syllable register she reserves for maximum emotional weight, telling me I had upset my father, that I was lying in a hospital bed on painkillers making threats against the people who had raised me and sacrificed for me, that I needed to be reasonable and calm down, that what had happened was a borrowing of equity, not a theft, and I needed to understand the distinction. I listened to her call the liquidation of my home a borrowing, with the patient attention of someone cataloging evidence. And then she called me selfish. She said I had always been selfish, always hoarding my success and my resources while my sister struggled, always prioritizing my own security over the needs of the family. And I listened to that word land in the antiseptic air of the recovery room, and I thought, 32 years of being the safety net that everyone in this family stepped on without looking down. 32 years of being the first call when the car broke down, or the taxes were overdue, or the mortgage went underwater. And I am the selfish one. Then I said, in a tone she had never heard from me before, and would not understand until it was far too late, Mom, do you actually know who holds the deed to the house on Maple Drive right now? The legal owner of the property you are standing in? She said, what? And I told her she should check the San Diego County Public Records portal. She said I was on drugs and not making sense, and that she would see me at the wedding, and suggested I wear something that covered the surgical scarring. I hung up. The third call was to Ruth Allen, my father's older sister, 65, a retired forensic CPA who had spent her career reading the financial architecture of other people's disasters, the only member of the Allen bloodline who had ever looked at me and registered a human being rather than an available resource. Ruth picked up on the first ring and told me she already knew, that Dale had called her an hour earlier with some elaborate family investment framing, and she had told him he was out of his mind and would testify against him if it came to that. She told me she had warned him for years, and the phrase she used for what he had treated me as, an ATM with a pulse, landed with the precision of something that had been waiting years for the right moment to be said aloud. I told her what I needed: a courier, a secret held for exactly 3 weeks, and a seat in the front row. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Once you cross this line, they will never forgive you, Sienna." And I said, "Ruth, they sold my home while I was fighting for my life on an operating table. They traded my future for a designer veil and a seafood tower. Forgiveness was off the table the second they picked up that pen." Another silence. Then, "What do you need from me?" And I told her, and I heard her exhale slowly, in the way people exhale when they have been watching a slow disaster build for years and have finally been given permission to do something about it. 1 week after surgery, Marcus Vane arrived at my temporary apartment with a bespoke charcoal suit and a leather briefcase and set a folder on my kitchen table with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who has spent his career converting family disasters into actionable legal instruments. He had pulled the complete documentation on the condo sale, and the fraudulent power of attorney was, in his exact words, so poorly executed that a handwriting analyst would dismiss it in under 60 seconds. My name rendered in a shaky, uncertain scrawl that shared no meaningful characteristics with my actual signature. The kind of forgery produced by someone working quickly and without much concern for scrutiny, because the plan had never included the possibility of me being awake and functional to scrutinize it. The notary stamp came from a man in Nevada with a documented history of rubber stamping documents without verification, operating in the gray legal margins where desperate people pay for the appearance of legitimacy. The sale itself could not be reversed. The buyer was an innocent third party who had no knowledge of the fraud and was protected under the bona fide purchaser doctrine. And unwinding a completed real estate transaction would require years of litigation, with no guaranteed outcome. That door was closed, and I let it be closed, because the door I needed was a different one. Marcus pulled the second document from his briefcase. The deed to 247 Maple Drive in Claremont Mesa, still held in my name through the anonymous LLC, clean and unencumbered, never touched by the condo transaction because they had not known it existed. And the lease, which expired on April 19th, exactly 7 days after the wedding scheduled for April 12th. He set it beside the fraud file and met my eyes with the expression of a litigator who has just confirmed that his client's position is considerably stronger than the opposing party has any concept of. If I serve them a notice to vacate now, they have 30 days from the date of service, he said. Given that the lease is already terminating, the timing is... He let the implication stand without finishing it, because the arithmetic was obvious. Draft the notice, I said. I'll tell you exactly when to serve it. 1 week before the wedding, Tessa called. Her voice was the warm, confectionery register she deploys when she is about to ask for something or deliver a weapon wrapped in pleasantry. And she told me she had heard I had been upsetting the family over some financial misunderstanding. And when I said, flatly and with no ornamentation, that our parents had liquidated my condo, the property I had spent 5 years of 80-hour weeks to purchase, she said with a breezy, almost admiring dismissiveness, "You're single. You're always working. You don't need a 2-bedroom in North Park just to store your monitors. It's not like you have a husband or a real family to provide for." I let the silence between us expand until it had the density of something solid and load-bearing. Then I said, "You tracked my property listings. You knew the exact surgery window. You delivered my asset information to them like an intelligence briefing and pointed them at me like a loaded weapon, Tessa." The pause that followed was not the pause of false accusation. It was the pause of someone whose carefully managed internal narrative has just collided at speed with an external one, the crack audible through the phone. She stumbled, said she had just mentioned I had assets and wasn't using them for the family. And I said, "You pointed them at me, and now you are going to watch what happens next." She called me jealous. She said I was 32 and alone and couldn't stand watching her be happy in the spotlight. I said I would see her at the wedding and wouldn't dream of causing a scene since she had mentioned the live stream to her sponsors. I hung up. The trap had closed completely. The social media preemptive strike came the following evening at 7:43 p.m. Tessa launched it from what appeared to be a bridal boutique fitting room, a staged photograph with a softening filter, mascara-touched eyes, quivering lip, a pile of white tulle arranged around her with the artful carelessness of someone who has spent 4 years learning how to make staged things look spontaneous, captioned with language about a jealous sister trying to destroy her most important day, about bitterness and isolation and stolen joy. Within an hour, the comments had erupted into the specific ecosystem of performative empathy that social platforms generate when they sense a clean villain and an articulate victim. And my phone began vibrating with an unbroken sequence of calls from relatives and family friends, arriving with predetermined verdicts and zero curiosity about a second perspective. I screenshotted every single piece of it. The original post, the comments calling me pathetic and bitter and a narcissist, the private messages from people who had eaten at my table, and saved them to a folder on my laptop labeled Evidence, because I had spent my entire career understanding that documentation is not aggression, it is architecture, and I was in the process of building something that would need to hold considerable weight. I want to stop here for just a second, because I know some of you are wondering how I held it all together through these weeks, carrying what I was carrying while physically recovering from major spinal surgery. If this story is speaking to something real in your life, give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't yet, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Now let's get to the wedding. Because what happens in that reception pavilion is something 200 people will talk about for the rest of their lives. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Tuesday evening in a private dining room in Little Italy. White tablecloths, candles, the kind of menu where every item is described as artisanal and arrives in portions calibrated for aesthetics rather than appetite. The bill posted on Tessa's wedding planning story at $12,000 for one evening's dinner for 25 people. I arrived late, moving slowly with my cane, and the room went to a murmur when I appeared in the doorway, the sound of conversation dipping the way it dips when the person everyone has been discussing walks in while they are still mid-sentence. Diane's face performed a rapid, practiced sequence, guilt surfacing briefly before being submerged under a socialite smile. And Dale's jaw tightened with the expression of a man who has just realized that a piece he believed removed from the board has returned with different capabilities than it had before. At the end of the evening, Tessa approached me with a smile that operated independently of her eyes and said she was surprised I'd come given my condition. I told her I had a gift for the wedding, something one of a kind she would see on Saturday. The uncertainty that moved through her face was the first, clean, uncomplicated satisfaction I had felt in 6 weeks. I walked out into the cool ocean air of La Jolla, my back a steady line of fire, the trap set and waiting. April 12th arrived with the specific, indifferent perfection of a San Diego spring morning. Cloudless cobalt sky, a Pacific breeze carrying salt, and the expensive jasmine the florist had arranged along the entrance path. The kind of morning that makes everything look like it was staged for a magazine spread about other people's beautiful lives. The lodge at Torrey Pines had been transformed into something that required the vocabulary of theater rather than event planning. White roses by the thousands, flown in from Ecuador, cascading from wrought iron archways in deliberate, studied abundance. Crystal chandeliers suspended from temporary pavilions catching the mid-morning light and shattering it into 1,000 moving fragments across the faces of 200 guests on the hand-laid stone paths of the garden courtyard. A string quartet from the San Diego Symphony rendering Pachelbel's canon with the composed, professional remove of musicians who have soundtracked enough of human life's pivotal moments to have developed informed opinions about which ones are genuine. I arrived with Ruth, who wore a structured navy blazer and moved through the assembled crowd with the watchful, unhurried attention of a forensic accountant who has learned to see the numbers inside the decoration. I wore a simple navy sheath dress. We had not coordinated the color. It felt like the right signal anyway. The ceremony unfolded with the technical flawlessness of an event where everyone involved has been paid enough to be professional, regardless of what they privately know or suspect. Tessa came down the garden aisle in $22,000 of French lace and Italian silk, a cathedral-length veil trailing behind her like a captured weather system. And she was genuinely, objectively beautiful in the way that people who have made being seen their entire vocation eventually become very skilled at inhabiting the moment of being seen. When she passed my row, her eyes found mine for the duration of half a breath, and the small, satisfied, proprietary smirk that moved across her face was the expression of a predator who has confirmed that the threat has been neutralized and the outcome is secured. I smiled back, the steady, quiet smile of an analyst who has confirmed that the vulnerability is precisely where she calculated it would be, that the architecture of the response is sound, and that the only remaining variable is timing. When the officiant reached the traditional language about objections, speak now or forever hold your peace, I felt the physical sensation of 200 pairs of eyes rotating toward table 14 in a single, synchronized movement, the tension in the garden thickening the air perceptibly. I did not move. I kept my gaze forward and my expression neutral. Tessa's shoulders released from a height they had been holding since the processional began, and the widening of her smile told me she believed the absence of disruption confirmed her victory, and she had not yet understood that what was coming was not an interruption. It was the final act, and I had been saving it for the stage she had built herself. The reception pavilion was a white-tented structure strung with thousands of warm fairy lights, the head table elevated on a small platform like a throne for a court that had not yet received the news of its dissolution. I was seated at table 14, adjacent to the kitchen service entrance, what Ruth identified, in a quiet murmur, as the Siberia of the seating chart. The table reserved for people Diane felt obligated to invite, but had no interest in presenting. I ate. I watched. I waited with the particular patience that belongs to someone who knows exactly what is coming, and has already done all the work required for it to arrive. Dale rose and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, and delivered a speech about sacrifice and unity and family love with the inflated, self-congratulatory gravity of a man performing his own most favorable biographer, and he used the word contributed to describe what I had involuntarily provided, deploying it with the casual ease of someone who has so thoroughly rewritten his internal narrative that the crime has become, in his own telling, a form of philanthropy, a contribution to a collective dream. He said many people had made this day possible, his gaze sweeping the room and landing on me for a fraction of a second, just long enough to transmit the frequency of predatory triumph. And then he raised his glass and announced that he thought I should come up and give my sister a toast she would never forget. He was right about that part. I reached for my cane. I stood up. The walk to the front of the pavilion was the longest I had taken since leaving the hospital. Not because of the pain, though the pain was present, steady, a low current beneath everything, but because every step was landing in the silence of a room that had just collectively sensed that something was about to happen that no one had a script for, and the silence had a quality that amplified each footfall of my cane against the polished hardwood into something that sounded, in that particular acoustic space, like a countdown. I climbed the 2 steps to the elevated platform. Dale handed me the microphone with a tight smile and a whispered instruction, close enough that I could detect the bourbon, to make it quick and make it sweet. I turned to face 200 people seated under crystal chandeliers and warm fairy lights, surrounded by flowers that had been paid for with my future, and I waited for the complete, absolute silence that arrives when a crowd simultaneously understands it is about to witness something it did not come prepared for. And then I said, "Thank you, Dad. You're right. I have contributed to this wedding quite a lot, actually. More than anyone else in this room, save for the bank." The murmuring stopped as though a switch had been thrown. I told them about the surgery, the 9 hours, the spinal reconstruction, the anesthesia. I told them that while I was unconscious on that operating table, while surgeons were working at the base of my spine to preserve my ability to walk, my parents had made a family decision. I said $425,000, and I let the number occupy the room alone for a moment, without commentary. I said they had forged my signature on a power of attorney and used it to liquidate my entire life's equity to pay for the roses in those archways, and the champagne in those glasses, and the $22,000 dress. The gasps came in waves, first confused, then comprehending, then something past comprehension that had no clean name. I pulled the documents from my clutch, the fraudulent power of attorney, the signature that looked like a child's approximation of my name, the Nevada notary stamp, and I set them where the nearest camera could see them. Guests looked at each other with the expressions of people who have just understood they are standing inside a crime scene, dressed as a celebration. Dale stepped forward from the head table, his face cycling rapidly through purple and gray. I said, without raising my voice by a single register, "You had your speech. This is mine." Then I pulled the second document, the one bearing the gold seal of the San Diego County Recorder, and I said, "This is the deed to 247 Maple Drive in Claremont Mesa. The house you grew up in, Tessa. The house Mom and Dad have been living in for 20 years. In 2021, when they were 60 days from foreclosure, someone bought their debt and saved the house. They thought it was an investment management company. They have been paying rent to that company for 4 years, sometimes late, always with complaints about corporate greed. That company was me. I am the legal owner of the house they are currently living in, and I have been for 4 years. The lease expires in 30 days, and I've already decided I am not renewing it." The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then the room fractured. Voices, the percussion of chairs scraping stone floors, the sound of a social reality collapsing in real time at a volume that the string quartet's instruments could not have competed with, even if the musicians had been inclined to try. Diane went chalk white, her champagne silk dress suddenly looking like a costume from the wrong production. Dale grabbed the edge of the head table as though the floor had shifted, which, in every way that mattered, it had. Marcus Vane entered from the rear of the pavilion, tall, unhurried, bespoke gray suit, leather briefcase, moving through the assembled guests with the composed gravity of a man who has no interest in what any of them think of him. and he confirmed in the measured, professional cadence of a litigator addressing civilians that his client held the legal deed to the Maple Drive property, that the power of attorney used to liquidate the North Park condominium was a fraudulent instrument under active criminal review, and that comprehensive charges including identity theft, wire fraud, and grand larceny were currently being prepared for filing. Grant Whitfield stood up from the head table. His face was the face of a man watching everything he understood about his own life rearrange itself into a configuration he does not recognize. He looked at my mother and said, in the cracked, careful voice of someone employing everything they have to stay in control of themselves, "The money for this wedding, the $300,000 your family contributed, that came from Grace's condo?" Diane studied her manicure with the intensity of someone searching for an exit that is not there. Grant pulled away from Tessa's grip with a sharpness that sent her nearly stumbling on the cathedral veil, and he said, "You told me it was a legacy fund. You said it was family savings set aside for decades." Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it. The hesitation was a confession, and every person in the room read it as one. Claire Whitfield rose from her seat with the synchronized, deliberate authority of someone who has made decisions of consequence before and understands exactly how they feel from the inside. And she said, in a voice carrying the specific temperature of generations of old money protecting its own interests, "We need to speak with you. Now. In the library." Tessa stumbled after Grant through the wreckage of the reception, through spilled wine and discarded lobster shells, and the cathedral veil dragging behind her like everything she had built pulling loose from its moorings, calling his name. And he stopped and turned and said, "Explain what? That your family stole from your sister while she was unconscious on an operating table to throw a party? That you knew and said nothing while I signed a marriage license in front of 100 people?" And Tessa cried. Not the filtered, curated Paris effect tears of the Instagram story she had posted 4 days earlier, but real tears, unmanaged and ugly, mascara running in black lines down her face. The kind of crying that happens when the performance ends and the person underneath it suddenly has no idea who they are without it running. The string quartet had put down their instruments. The waitstaff stood frozen with magnums of champagne they no longer knew what to do with. The door to the library closed behind the Whitfields and Tessa and Grant with a heavy, decisive click that sounded, in that particular silence, like the end of something. I set the microphone down on the platform surface and walked off the stage, and the crowd parted for me the way crowds part for someone who has done something irreversible. And I walked through the parted garden of 200 witnesses out into the cool air of the Torrey Pines hillside, where the Pacific was running in long, slow lines toward the shore 100 feet below. And I sat down on a stone bench in the garden and let the wind move over me and said nothing at all for a very long time. I'm pausing here because what happened next in that garden and everything that unfolded in the weeks and months that followed changed the trajectory of every single person who had been in that room. If you've made it this far, please take a second and hit that like button. Leave a comment with what you're feeling right now, and subscribe if you want to hear the full aftermath. Now let's get back to what happened after I walked off that stage. People left in small, quiet groups, moving past me with the averted eyes of guests at a disaster site who have not yet decided what the polite response to a disaster is. My cousin Kyle, who had once helpfully suggested I had always been a bit difficult, did not make eye contact as he hurried toward the valet stand. But Claire Whitfield came out of the pavilion in her Chanel suit, sat down beside me on the stone bench with the composed bearing of someone conducting a final, necessary piece of business, and told me the Whitfield family had known nothing about the source of the wedding funding, that their name was not and would not be associated with fraud. And then she said something I had not been expecting. That Grant's laptop had gone missing from Tessa's apartment 3 months earlier, and that he now believed she had stolen it to access the details of his trust fund documentation before the proposal. She stood and straightened her jacket and said, as a final observation rather than a comfort, "A marriage built on a felony was never going to last." She walked away, and the annulment proceedings were filed before the week was out. The fallout moved with the velocity of a story that has found the right current and the right platform. By Monday morning, the video, captured on no fewer than 30 phones by guests who had arrived expecting a wedding and received something considerably more consequential, was trending across multiple platforms with a volume that no one in my family had the infrastructure to manage. Dale's employer placed him on administrative leave pending an ethics review, noting that footage of a senior company representative being publicly accused of felony fraud by his own child constituted a material concern under their existing morality clause, and 32 years of consistent performance could not outweigh a viral video playing on a loop in every meeting room in the building. Diane's social standing, the book club, the charity committee, the La Jolla Gala circuit she had spent 20 years cultivating with the methodical attention of a professional investor, dissolved within 72 hours. The people she had maintained as social equity, evaporating the moment association with her became a reputational liability rather than an asset. Tessa's public profile became its own kind of ruins. The annulment was finalized in record time. The Whitfield family demanded the return of $150,000 in venue deposits, and Tessa, operating without real income and with a lifestyle built entirely on family money and optimistic projections, did not have it. 2 weeks after the wedding, she began her first sustained employment in 6 years. A retail associate position at a department store in Mission Valley, minimum wage plus commission, and by all accounts spent several of her early shifts folding clothes for people who used to follow her on Instagram. 30 days after the wedding, Dale called. His voice had become a different instrument than the one I had known my whole life. Smaller, worn at the edges, carrying the specific quality of a man who has had something removed from him and is not accustomed to loss moving in that direction. He said they had to be out of the house by Friday and had nowhere to go, and I said, clearly and without performance, "That is not my problem, Dale. You have a 30-day notice on a lease that was more than fair. You are fortunate that the discussion we are having right now is about a lease rather than about a sentencing hearing." I hung up, and my pulse was steady, and what I felt was not satisfaction. It was the sober, clean relief of a boundary drawn at last, not in anger, but in the quiet, clear-eyed certainty of someone who has finally run out of reasons to keep moving it. 2 months later, I walked through the empty house on Maple Drive for the first time as its acknowledged owner, knowing that I owned it, saying it out loud for the first time. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame were still there, my height at 6, 8, 10, 12. The year my father told me I would have to work harder. The year I became the version of myself that built everything you have heard about in this story. Ruth stood in the doorway and asked how I felt, and I told her honestly that I didn't know, that I just felt sad it had come to this, that all of it, every decision, every sacrifice, every dollar and year and hour, had been trying to answer a question about whether I mattered to the people who were supposed to know the answer without being asked, and the question had finally been answered, definitively and permanently, just not in the way I had spent 32 years hoping it would be. I rented the house to a young couple, two public school teachers who were building something real and unglamorous and entirely their own. And the rental income has gone since the first month to a legal aid organization that works specifically with victims of financial exploitation within families. 3 months after the wedding, I saw my mother in Balboa Park on a Sunday afternoon in early summer, sitting alone on a bench near the botanical garden entrance, smaller than I remembered her. The social architecture she had spent decades constructing no longer visible in the way she held her shoulders. I sat down beside her, leaving the space between us appropriate for two people who share a history too complicated for the language currently available to either of them. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was, that I was finally walking on my own 2 feet, which was true in more ways than the orthopedic one. She nodded slowly, rose from the bench, and walked away without completing the sentence she had started to form. And I sat in the sun for a long time after she was gone, feeling the warmth on my face and the specific, unfamiliar quality of a silence that belongs to someone who has finally stopped waiting for something that was never coming. And I did not hate her, and I was not angry, and I was not triumphant. I was just done. My spine is healing. 6 months of recovery, the slow, unglamorous daily work of rebuilding what was damaged, marked by the small milestones of distance walked and stairs taken without thinking about them, and mornings woken without the sciatic fire that had been my constant companion for 3 years. I no longer need the cane for any regular distance. On clear mornings, I drink my coffee on the balcony of my apartment and watch the marine layer lifting off the city. And I think about what it costs to build a life entirely from scratch, and how long it takes, and how devastatingly quickly the people who were supposed to be its first protectors can dismantle it. And how the truth, delivered in the right room, with the right documentation, and the composure of someone who has nothing left to perform, remains the most effective instrument of restoration available to a person who has been told their whole life that what they built belongs to someone else. I don't tell this story for revenge, and I want to be clear about that, because the word gets applied to situations like mine with a frequency that fundamentally misrepresents what actually happens when a person stops accepting being treated as a resource and starts insisting, quietly and without apology, on being treated as a human being. What happens at that wedding was disclosure, the transfer of accurate information to the people who were owed it, in the only forum where it could not be managed or suppressed or reframed into something more palatable by people with decades of practice in doing exactly that. The truth is not a weapon. It is just the truth. And the only people who experience its arrival as violent are the ones who have been building their lives on the assumption that it will never show up. Setting a boundary is not revenge. It is the most basic act of self-preservation available to you. And it is available even when, especially when, the people requiring the boundary are the ones who were supposed to teach you, long before you needed to learn it the hard way, that you were worth protecting. Blood does not erase a forged signature. Love does not obligate you to absorb a felony. The condo is gone, and $425,000 of compressed life is not coming back through any legal instrument currently available to me. And I have made my peace with that in the only way you actually make peace with a loss. Not by pretending it was fine, but by deciding that what remains is enough to build forward from. And what remains is this: I am still here, walking on my own 2 feet, in full possession of the only thing they never managed to take: the knowledge of exactly who I am and exactly what I am worth, and the certainty that those 2 things were never theirs to decide. If you have made it to the very end of this story, I want to say thank you, genuinely, for listening all the way through. If you have ever been the safety net that no one noticed until you stopped catching them, if you have ever been invisible in your own family while being indispensable to it, if you have ever had to choose between loving someone and protecting yourself, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone in this, and what you went through matters. And the fact that you are still standing is not a small thing. Hit that like button, leave a comment with what you are taking away from this, and subscribe if you want to hear what comes next. Until then, take care of yourselves. Your security is not a family asset. You matter. See you in the next one.